Hey everybody. So before we hop into this session, I would like to speak a little bit about what this channel is going to be about. So for now, this channel is going to be mostly chess focused, although it may change in the future. And the hope is that I'm going to be posting mostly educational chess videos, so teaching you guys about how to play chess and how to improve your game and become better. I am around 2000 elo on Lee Chess, depending on the time control. And I believe I peaked at around 1700 or 1800 on chess.com. I haven't played very much on chess 24. Anyway, obviously, I cannot teach you the highest echelons of chess. I am not a master player, not really anywhere near that level. But I can still teach people that are beginners or maybe just lower class players that really haven't spent a lot of time in the game yet. Alright, so we're going to be starting with a very, very basic introductory course. This is probably going to be a little bit too simple for many of you, but if you are just hopping into the game of chess, this will hopefully be very useful to you. And if you are a little bit more advanced in this course, have no fear. I will be making further videos that will hopefully help you at your chess level. So, if you want to see more of these videos, you can subscribe, and later I will be getting to more complex topics. Alright, so first I just wanted to display here how chess is generally played from the opening. So, chess is all about controlling the center squares of the board. So, usually in the opening, all of the moves that we are making are in some way trying to affect these four squares in the center of the board. And the reason why we will hopefully get to later in the session. But basically, these squares are the most... they make your pieces the strongest. They are the best squares to place your pieces onto. And so we want to control these squares with pawns, because pawns are the base unit in chess, and they allow us to control territory. On their own, they are not strong because they cannot move in a way that is they can't move in a way that allows us to attack our opponent very easily. They move very slowly, but because they are so slow and sturdy, they really define the position, and they make everything, they clear up the play a lot. So all of our moves in the early game are going to be centered around pushing to the center and attacking the center, right? So this black pawn you can see is attacking the white pawn. These flanking pawns attack. Sometimes you just push up the center pawns and then defend with the flanking pawns, right? Sometimes you'll defend the center pawn with another center pawn. But all of these moves are based around defending these key squares, right? Or attacking the key squares, either defending or attacking. So yeah, that's really the basis of all openings. And we will get to some other openings where maybe you don't directly attack the center, but you still are applying pressure. So we'll talk about that later. Okay, so the purpose of this section here is just to show you why these center squares are so good. That's really all we're going to be talking about today. So, we can see this black knight, and it is much closer to the center than this white knight. You can see this white knight is on the edge of the board. And one thing we say about white knights, or sorry, not white knights, but knights on the edge of the board, is that a knight on the rim is dim. There are many other phrases, but basically, it's just a little way to help you remember that you don't really want your knights on the edge of the board. So why is that? Well, we can see that this black knight is attacking 8 different squares. And the other thing about the squares is that many of them are central squares, notably these two. This one's also kind of a central square. And there are also squares that are near the king. Kings will generally be on squares like this and this. The thing you'll notice about this white knight is that it only has 4 squares that it can go to. And you'll actually see that this black knight is controlling 2 of the squares that the white knight can go to, right? So if our white knight jumped to those squares, it would be taken by the black knight. And this is called dominating a piece. So specifically knights, this is usually the case, that you dominate the knight because it cannot move forward. It will be captured. So it has to move back. It is dominated. So let's say white just moves back here, and we'll just make a waiting move with black. And then we'll hop back in here. And what you're going to see is that white has significantly improved his knight, right? He's now on 8 squares. And the squares are very active. 2 of them are in the immediate center. 2 of them are towards the enemy king, and 2 of them are kind of defending his king, maybe. So this is why we generally would play something like knight h3 in the opening rather than, we would generally play knight f3 in the opening rather than knight h3, because this square is more centralized and therefore it has more options and better options. That's all we had to take away from that. So here we can see that we have 2 bishops in the center of the board. Now, there are 2 diagonals in the game of chess that are very important. These 2 diagonals. As you can see, they are the longest diagonals on the board. So this white diagonal is notably shorter than this one, right? There's an extra square here. And that means that we are often going to want to put these bishops on these diagonals, if possible. You'll also notice that this diagonal and this diagonal are the longest intersections with this diagonal, right? So in other words, the white bishop can attack the most squares from this square and this square. And same for the black bishop. Once again, just showing you why these middle squares are so important, although it is not that common that your bishops will be in the center of the board until maybe later in the game. Also worth noting, by the way, is that this diagonal is pretty important because it's hitting the king, right? And likewise, this diagonal is hitting where this rook usually is. Same here. So those are important diagonals. You know, usually these squares are quite weak, and can maybe be attacked. All of these squares are common attack areas because of the bishops, really, because they're on the path of the long diagonals. Okay. Okay, so I told you earlier that there are going to be some opening strategies that don't involve immediately moving a pawn to the center. So, well, even in these situations, you still move a pawn in the center, but the point is that we're making these edge pawn moves, okay? Not usually moves like this unless, well, a more advanced idea. But anyway, you can see that these bishops are, even though they are far away, they are still controlling these center squares, right? This bishop is hitting this pawn, protecting our pawn. Whereas this bishop, you know, say there was a knight here, the knight can't jump into these middle squares, right? And as well, you remember we talked about these long diagonals, right? We're on the long diagonal, so that's good. And we are hitting this pawn right in front of the king. I mentioned again that these pawns tend to be weaknesses in the position. And if you can target them with your bishop, it's often very nice. So that's why we put our bishops here, and this is called fianchettoing. Or a fianchettoed bishop, or whatever you might want to say that. Okay, so this is our next discussion. So rooks are one of the interesting pieces in chess. Thing about rooks is they have a few different things that they want to get done in a chess game. So the first thing is that you want to connect your rooks. You want them to be able to see each other. And the importance of connecting your rooks can be displayed right here. And it would be better if I had placed another rook up here, but you'll still kind of get the point. So One other thing that rooks like is rooks like to have an open file. You'll notice my rook right now is behind a pawn, right? He's just hitting this pawn, and that is blocking a lot of his vision, right? He can only hit these 3 squares. That's all he really controls. If you imagine that this pawn was gone, if it was deleted off the board, we would call that a half open file. And then our rook would see all the way up to here, right? He could hit all of those squares. But if you imagine our rook being here, well, you don't have to imagine it because I just showed you. Now we get all of these squares, right? So it becomes very obvious that we want our rook to be on the open files because then we attack the most squares. And also we want our rook to be in the center, generally speaking. The other note I have here is that rooks tend to like to get behind enemy lines if possible. You have to be careful to have your rook trapped, but lots of times you want to be on the side of the pawns or behind the pawns, because then the pawns can't make moves that attack your rook. So okay, we wanted to take this open file, so we moved our rook here. Now the problem here is black can take our rook, and because our king is in the way, we cannot take back with the rook. If you imagine if our king was out of the way, we could take back with the rook, and then we would have control of the open file. As is, we take with our king, we don't have control of the open file. If black had another rook, they could move it here, and then we would have to move our king, and we wouldn't have control of this file. We could contest it still, but then he would trade rooks, and we wouldn't have control of the file. So, if we go all the way back, and we say, maybe we should have castled here, okay? So the significance of castling is that, let's just say black plays this move. Black can play whatever move, it doesn't really matter. Now, when we go to capture this open file, and black trades the rook, our rook is instantly onto the open file, okay? And if black tried to place a rook there now, he could not, because we could take it with check. And there's nothing defending that rook. He would need to move his king over twice, and then maybe he could contest this file again. So that's why we want our rooks to see each other, as well as it's difficult for the queen to attack the rook if you have 2 rooks connected, and things like that. Alright, so now we're going to talk about another condition that the rooks enjoy. Whenever you get your rooks on the 7th rank, it is usually bad news bears for your opponent, especially with both rooks. One rook is pretty powerful. Both rooks is like you're pretty much either checkmating your opponent, taking all of his pawns, or you're going to get some kind of draw. Unless, obviously lots of times they have a defense, but in the lower levels of the game, for sure, you're almost always going to get a draw or checkmate. And so I've just drawn out a line here where we gobble up all the pawns. And one of the important things to note here is that the rooks are controlling all of these squares, right? So the king cannot move to any of these squares. That's going to be important right here when black makes a silly move, right? We can simply move our rook up and checkmate because he cannot move to any of these squares. So this is another reason why a rook on the 7th rank can be very strong. It's because it creates a mating attack versus the king, and it also just cuts the king off. Like let's say maybe this isn't checkmate, but the king wants to defend this pawn, and he might want to move to one of these squares, but he can't move to those squares because of this rook. So that's why rooks really like being on the 7th rank. Alright. So here in this position, we are just looking at a queen. We're looking at the optimal place for a queen. So in the earlier stages of the game, it's not usually best to put your queen in the center of the board because the queen will be kicked away by various pieces. The queen is very powerful but sort of delicate in a way because you don't want to lose it, so you have to move it away from any kind of threat. But just in this position, we can see that white's queen is very dominant, right? He's got a wooden shield going on here, right? He's He's protecting 2 pawns, he's attacking 2 pawns, and Black's queen rather is kind of tied down to the defense of this pawn. I mean, there's maybe a move like this, probably good in this position. I think this is a total draw, but we can still just see that Black's queen on the edge of the board is just far more passive than this white queen, and that's partially because, like we talked about with the bishops, our queen is on a very long diagonal, right? So it just sees more squares than the black queen does. So that's part of it. But another part of it is just that these central squares, generally you're going to be affecting more things on the board at the same time. Okay, so now we're going to get into more of a general idea of how to place your pieces, okay? So it's not always the case that you can get your pieces to the center of the board. It's not always the case that you can get your rooks to an open file. So here we're going to be talking about X-rays. So what is an X-ray? This is a little bit more of an advanced topic, especially when you consider the things that we just went over. This is definitely a little bit more difficult to grasp, but hopefully you can grasp this because this is a very good positional idea that you can use in your games. So what do we notice about this position? The first thing I see when I look at this position is, hey, my rook is on the same file as his queen. Now, the thing is, you might say, well, that doesn't really matter at all, right? Because there's these pawns in the way. Like, who really cares about these rooks? The rook and the queen being on the same file. But the rook is X-raying these pawns, or X-raying the queen through these pawns. And while there's nothing available yet, there's no direct threat that the rook cannot take the queen. But it does tell me, it tips me off in my brain, alarms are going off. Hey, there's probably a tactic in this position. And if we look, okay, pawn takes pawn, and all of a sudden, there were 2 pawns in the way, now there's only 1 pawn in the way. And this pawn is actually pinned. You're about to see. Right, that pawn took my pawn, and all of a sudden I captured his queen. So we went from a fairly inconspicuous position, right? 2 pawns in the way, nothing's really going on. And all of a sudden we have a vicious attack, right? Now of course Black didn't have to do what he did, but we're just kind of making a display here. So let's just say Black makes 2 not very useful moves. And the other piece that we see has an X-ray going. This bishop, once again, there are 2 pawns in the way. But this is, this bishop is on the same rank as this king. It's sending off alarm bells in my head. Okay, there's probably going to be a tactic, or not always is there a tactic, but this is a good place to look for tactics, right? So we push the pawn forward. Black is totally oblivious. And we have a really nice tactic here where we have pinned this pawn. Queen takes bishop, right? This pawn cannot take because it would be check. So it just goes to show, if you're looking for good places to put your pieces, it is often nice to put your bishop on the same diagonal as the king, even if there are other things in the way. That's just generally a nice thing to do. And it's almost always good to put your, well, I shouldn't say almost always. It's often good, though, to put your rook on the same file as your queen. And as the enemy queen, rather. And if you are the enemy in this situation, you want to get your queen off of this file. And also, if you are the enemy, you might want to think about sidestepping this, right? So this is kind of like a high-level move. You will not see this a lot in your games, but the computer will play it all the time. Okay, so like let's say White did this. That's bad. Let's say White did this. Okay, Black can now just sidestep. and there's no longer this pin, right? Or even if the pawn was still there, there's no longer this X-ray. It's good to make this preemptive move because what you're doing is you're saying, hey, there might be a tactic in this position. Let's get rid of that tactic. I'm just going to move my king and be safe. So if you ever have time to make a move like this, it can often be a very strong move. All right, and then we're going to look at the last piece just to show you how important the center is in this game. So this is a position where this is an endgame, obviously. Now, early in the game, you've probably heard, or you're going to hear, that you should always try to keep your king out of the center of the board, right? You want to castle either, well, your king's not usually on that square. You want to castle one of these directions, right? But in the end of the game, you actually really want your king to be in the center of the board. In fact, it's one of the most important things you can do. As soon as the endgame is starting, you should kind of try to move your king to the center. I mean, there's other moves that might be better, but usually that's very strong. And we're going to see right here, right? Even pawns, 4-4. And the structure is identical for both players. And the kings are, okay, so maybe white has like a little bit, you know, he's a little bit closer, right? But they're pretty close together. But white's king has made it to the center quicker, and it will pay dividends in this game. So we start with this move. Important to note that you don't really want to play this move because black can chase down your pawns, right? And I haven't calculated this out or anything, but it's probably going to be drawish, or at least hard to win. Yeah, I mean, I would think that this is a draw. Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess you're 2 tempos up. It's probably winning for white, but this move is much simpler, right? Because black cannot move to any of these squares. He is totally trapped. So because white took control of the center, he has complete control over who passes through the center, right? Black has no control over white pushing through, whereas white has all the control over black pushing through. So, you know, I could make this move and push through, sure, but I can also make this move and stop black from pushing through, which is actually a much stronger move because the only real move is for black to either go back or here. Neither of them are very good. And then it's pretty clear, right? We just march our king, take all the pawns, he takes all the pawns, and then we run our little pawn to queening victory. Yeah, and this is going to be a fairly simple endgame to win here. You could even just trade the queen for both of the pawns. It's no problem. So, what did we learn here today? Well, we learned that these 4 central squares are very important because all of our pieces are best when placed on these squares. Maybe not the rook, but even for the rook, lots of times you can pull your rook up the board and then do what is called a rook lift. So you move your rook outside of the pawn chain. But yeah, these middle 4 squares are very, very important because they are the best squares for your pieces. And so it's really important that you take control of them with pawns and then support the pawns with heavier pieces. So I hope you learned something from that. If you like this video, please like, subscribe, ring the bell, do whatever you need to do. And I will see you back for another video, probably tomorrow. So thanks so much for watching. I hope you learned something.